Well, thanks very much, Janice, and thanks for that warm welcome. First of all, I think we should all recognise a debt of gratitude to PCS Left Unity for organising the meeting. It's been absolutely critical, to my mind, that as many activists from as many unions get together precisely for the reason that Janice described, to assess the situation we're in, work out what it is we want to do next, and ensure that the spirit of unity and cooperation at grassroots level of the trade union movement is maintained as much as possible. Because I think that is the key to us getting through this difficult period that we now find ourselves in. So I think it's a big congratulations to PCS Left Unity and also to everyone who's come. It's very early in January, as Janice has said, this is a major commitment that many people have made. I also want to thank those who've been prepared to speak. I particularly want to say publicly that I have nothing but admiration for those people in unions that don't operate a democratic culture, who witch hunt their activists when they're prepared to not toe the party line, sometimes speak at these events, and it's a brave thing to do. I want to say to those that not only do I admire you, but all of us should recognise the importance in every union now of people being prepared to speak out and stand up in defence of their members' pensions. It's never been more important. And I hope that the solidarity that we can generate at local level will mean that those who are in unions where a more open and democratic culture prevails will be able to offer full solidarity to those who may encounter some difficulties in the weeks and months ahead. But Janice, what I wanted to do in the opening remarks is really just sketch out where we are in terms of the talks, or lack of them, with the government, where the leaderships of the major unions say they are in terms of TUC discussions, and how we move forward from here. And in so doing, I think it is important that we have a bit of an analysis about how it could be that we go from the biggest, most successful strike in Britain in generations to seeing major parts of that coalition trying to withdraw from it before Christmas. Because I think that takes some explaining and some understanding, and I think it's important that we deal with some of that. And in that sense, some people have said that over the last few weeks, PCS and others have broken with precedent. We appear to be criticising others, and we're saying things that are out with the normal rules of the game. Our attitude is simple. The stakes are absolutely massively high. And now is not the time to be observing diplomatic niceties. Now is the time to speak it as it is to all workers in Britain, so that we all know in the trade union movement we face the biggest series of attacks by this government than any of us will ever have seen. The government's austerity programme seeks to make those with the least pay the biggest price to sort out an economic problem that they did not create. We know that pensions is just one part of that. If you work in the public sector at the moment, pensions are under attack. But you've also had a 2-year pay freeze. You now have a further 2 years of a 1% pay policy. 710,000 jobs are going to be cut. Privatisation, which I believe is one of the real motivations behind these pension reforms, is now likely to pick up at breathtaking speed. In addition to that, our friends and our families are suffering, our communities are suffering. Never have I think we faced a situation where so much is being done by those at the top to those at the bottom, and they hope that people will just put up with it. And in that sense, the resistance that we saw on June the 30th, November the 30th, and the magnificent TUC demonstration in March was a real inspiration to those who believe that there is a different way, there's an alternative, and we don't have to just accept that it's going to happen. And already I think there's evidence that the confidence that we showed on November the 30th has meant that our colleagues in the private sector have also been emboldened to rise up and take action. And let me be the first to pay tribute publicly to those members of the unions in Unilever who struck in the private sector in defence of their pensions and are already I also want to say publicly that the 4 unions in June the 30th, the ATL, the UCU, the NUT and the PCS, should take great credit that their members were prepared to stand out front and transform the situation and take strike action when many, including those in our own movement, attacked us for being premature, for being strike happy, for talking about strikes or taking strikes when the government wanted to talk. It was a brave thing for people to do. But I tell you what, if you went to the TUC meeting that followed June the 30th, nobody could have failed to witness how that brilliant strike in the summer transformed the mood across the unions and across the country, and even infected those union leaders who did not want to be part of the struggle that we've seen in the run-up to November the 30th. So great credit goes to the 500,000 members of the teaching, education, lecturers unions and the PCS for the strike in June the 30th. And it paved the way for November the 30th. Now I think we should all not lose sight of the fact how brilliant November the 30th was. Up to 2 million people, 29 unions involved, dominated the media for weeks in advance, meant communities were discussing the issues of austerity and resistance the length and breadth of the land. It was one of the most inspiring days to be a trade unionist that I personally have seen in decades. And it showed us a glimpse of the power that the trade union movement potentially has when we work together and stand up to the government. And that is why the brilliance of that day means that the situation we find ourselves now is very serious and needs to be properly analysed about the way forward. And to do that, I think we have to understand that getting to November the 30th was not easy. It didn't happen on its own. All of the unions did not just conclude now is the time to have a public sector-wide strike. Many of them resisted up until the end. The government believed we would never get the unity that we demonstrated, and therefore sat back in the mistaken belief that ultimately we would fracture even before the starting gun was fired, and they would be able to do separate deals in the separate schemes. And I have to say to you that the difficulty in getting to where we go was most clearly exposed in the talks that Kevin Courtney and I, along with other TUC leaders, went to with the government. Because not once, but twice, in June and on the 2nd of November, the most senior trade unionists in Britain, openly in front of government ministers at the negotiations, made it clear they did not agree with what we were saying. They did not agree that we should throw out the heads of agreement, and they made it clear that we spoke not for the trade union movement, but only for ourselves. And within hours of that meeting, the media was running reports of division, of people being loony lefties, and how the leadership of the TUC felt very uncomfortable with the whole thing. Seized on by government ministers to take it, as we know they took it further, to try and isolate those unions that they thought were most likely to stand up and resist, and try to demonise them while damning with faint praise the moderate unions who apparently want to represent their members, while those of us who don't just want to call the strikes. I can't think of a more serious betrayal in the run-up to a national strike than the leaders of our movement telling government ministers they did not agree with where we stood, and actually they did not even agree that we should rule out in principle increasing the pension age and making red lines about the 3 key issues in this dispute. So it was difficult getting to November the 30th. But we did get there, and it was the most magnificent day. Now, once the government had seen the power of what we did on November the 30th, I think they then decided that now was the time to move quickly and try to divide and split up the trade union movement. Now, I can't think of a more serious error when you've just had the best strike we've seen in this country for years, to suddenly all scatter off and disperse into separate scheme talks and indicate that settlements were possible within the government's central framework. And what is even more extraordinary is it was apparent to all of us that after the 2nd of November, when the government said increase of pension age to 68, increase of contributions, and change of indexation from RPI to CPI could not even be discussed in the schemes, it was an absolute red line, then the answer was obvious to me anyway, that unless the government made central concessions on those issues, it would be impossible to get an acceptable outcome in scheme-specific negotiations. Why? Because to do so means you have to give up on the pension age, give up on the re-indexation and give up on asking people to pay more. Do you know something astonishing? Despite numerous appeals by us and others for the TUC to demand further central talks with the government, they failed to do so on any one occasion since the 2nd of November. And we now have a situation where we've had Britain's biggest strike for years, and we haven't even met the government negotiators since the beginning of November. It is how we've got to a situation where those scheme talks have now started dealing with the detail, the sharing out of the pain, rather than negotiations designed to say we don't want any of the changes that you're imposing on us. And therefore I do think it is worth us very clearly saying this. Every union leaflet that I saw, every single member who went on strike, in my view, went on strike against 3 central propositions: work longer, pay more, and get less. I don't recall any union saying we're going to the barricades over accrual rates. We're going to the barricades about death in service payments. We're going to the barricades about widows and orphans. It was not about the detail, a minute detail of each pension scheme. It was about the central proposition of work longer, pay more, get less. And comrades, if we are honest, every single person who went on strike still faces work longer, pay more, and get less. And if it was right to go on strike on November the 30th, and it was right to oppose this before the strike, it is absolutely right that we say now, we will not accept deals that force people to work longer, pay more, and get less. And I think it's really important. I just want to add this before I just set out what I think we should be doing next, is that if people haven't noticed, and I'm sure we all have here, whilst all this has been going on, the government hasn't sat back, waiting to see what happens and indicating that it may take its foot off the pedal in terms of austerity for the public sector. The day before the strike, George Osborne announced a further pay policy of 1% pay restrictions for the next 2 years. The TUC have calculated, for most public sector workers, that represents a 16% reduction in your living standards over 4 years. It was the day before the strike that estimates were increased about public sector job losses from 400,000 to 710,000. So they haven't scaled back, they have intensified their signal that working people must pay the price. So how can anyone believe that faced with the ante being upped on the other side, with such severe consequences, that now is the time for the trade union movement to stand back and say, well, all right then, we'll take the few crumbs that we have been given and we will retreat for a further day. And I tell you what, it actually makes me feel sick to the pit of my stomach when I see union leaders on the one hand withdrawing from the fray for peanuts, and on the next giving interviews in the papers talking about general strikes and how we are going to take further action in 2012. Comrades, if you're serious about taking action, you stay in this fight that is happening now. Now, therefore, I think we have to analyse where do we go in the period ahead. PCS has been absolutely clear that our view is that what the TUC should do when it meets on Thursday is that everyone should say the heads of agreement are unacceptable, and we want to call a further national coordinated strike as an absolute matter of urgency. We think that the government is expecting least of all an announcement that there should be further strikes. So we're absolutely clear. We argued it in December. We argued it when everybody else was trying to bail out at the meeting just before Christmas, and we're going to argue it again this week. The way to force real concessions is to show them again that we are prepared to all strike together. And in so doing, I think we should recognise this. There are 3 of the 4 pension schemes that are unfunded, pay-as-you-go schemes, on which there's a great deal of similarity. The local government scheme is different. It is part-funded. It does have assets. But the question we have to ask is, why would anybody not want to be part of a coalition of millions and take their chances in talks on their own scheme, having withdrawn from the fight for public sector pensions. I think we have to say whether you're a council worker, a nurse, a civil servant, teacher or lecturer, the best chance of defending our pensions for the future is not to retreat to the different aspects of your scheme, but to stand together across the whole of the public sector. And in that sense, I struggle to see how it is a victory that in one scheme, where it's conceded that people's pension age will go to 68, where it's conceded their pension will be devalued by 20% because of the inflation indexation, that in some way it is a victory to defer contributions by 2 years. It is not a victory, it is a monumental defeat that you will see in the months and years ahead. And that is why I hope that people in the local government unions will also stay in the fight with health, with education and the civil service, because divided we are weaker, and the government know that. And anyone who thinks, well, maybe it's not quite as simple as that, let's look at the detail. I for once want to quote Danny Alexander and Francis Maud. Danny Alexander in Parliament before Christmas said the government has got everything it wanted without a single penny being put on the table. Francis Maud went further. He said, we have proved that strikes do not work. What an appalling situation it is that the Tories can conclude strikes don't work. We've had the biggest, most successful strike in Britain for decades, and we have the ability to do such more. It is absolutely, in my view, to their eternal discredit that senior union leaders have been prepared to allow that situation to happen, and that instead of us now talking about a further national strike of millions, we're having to talk about how do we keep people in the coalition in the next few weeks ahead. Is utterly disgraceful. And maybe understanding the deep-seated fatalism that actually exists in many of those unions is the only way we can unlock the key to working out how have they done it. How have they gone from saying on the 29th of November it wasn't good enough to saying on the 20th of December that it is good enough? And maybe this will give you some understanding. One of Britain's most senior union leaders took me aside in July, having had the spat with the government where apparently I was being too provocative because I didn't want to accept what was going on. And he said to me, and I quote, "You are mad if you think that strikes can change anything. Some of us still have the scars on our back of the defeat of the miners, and never again will we go back to the trade union movement being isolated. The answer has to be constructive engagement with the government and not belief that we can oppose them through industrial action." Now, I cannot think of a more profound miscalculation and misunderstanding about how these things are sorted. What I do know is that for all our eggs in the basket of clever negotiators, being told that we're all moderate and reasonable and hoping for the best, will lead to the dismantling of our pension schemes for generations to come. I would choose every time the ability of working people to stand together, to take strike action, to force them to make concessions. And that, I think, is what we need to be concluded here today. So my final point, Janice, is this. If we understand how we've got to where we've got, if we understand how union leaders can talk about general strikes, and the biggest strikes is the miners 1 minute, and then the next minute spend the entire opening period of the most important TUC meeting in years slagging off the PCS and Janice Godrich and myself personally, then it begins, I think, to become clear about how the world is viewed by some people in the leadership of the unions. We have to say that's not how we do it. And that means all our energy has to be not accepting that the game is up, not accepting that there's only a few unions left, but actually redoubling our efforts to ensure in every union the argument is made, if it was right to strike together on November the 30th, it must be right to stand together now. And that is why I just want to say this really. Some people can sneer and say lobbies of meetings are not very good, that's not the way to do things. I can tell you as somebody went into the TUC before Christmas, having hundreds of people outside demonstrating absolutely helps stiffen you up and feel confident. Today, what we have to do is have a strategy to ensure that every activist and every member in every union understands where we are. They don't get blinded by 15 presentation slides that talk about accrual rates and finer details. We focus on the main issue. And that means that whilst it is right that PCS will call Thursday for further nationally coordinated action, we must not accept that unions have already withdrawn. And the immediate battle for us has to be doing whatever we can to support those activists in those unions where they're having to make arguments that are against a withdrawal of the pensions fight. Now I'll leave you with this thought. Once we know how that outcome goes, we do have to consider the question of industrial action. The government in Parliament said before Christmas PCS was entirely isolated. We have now seen Unite in the health sector, Unite in the civil service, the NUT, the NAS, NIPSA, all unions that have said no, we are not going along with it, and it is to the credit of those unions. Let's hope there's a lot more. But comrades, if it is the case that there's fewer unions left standing, that the next industrial action looks like being hundreds of thousands, not millions, any union worth its salt will analyse the situation that leaves itself in. And I want to say this, it may not be popular, it would be an absolute mistake if Janice and I, on behalf of PCS, say now we are calling a strike today, irrespective of knowing where anybody else stands. It is not responsible. It is not right when you can't even tell your members who else is going to be on strike. It is not right that we substitute ourselves for the battles that need to take place in other unions. But I tell you what is right. What is right is to say we are prepared to take further industrial action. We think further industrial action is absolutely essential. But if the coalition has got smaller, you have to review your tactics. Because a one-day strike of millions becoming a one-day strike of hundreds of thousands does not look like we're moving forward. My own view is this. If there's less people involved, you have to be prepared to consider taking more industrial action. Action that is probably more sustained. Action that is about having a hard-hitting effect on the government. And to do that, we've got to sit down in a room, and all the unions that still want to fight on should be prepared to have that discussion to discuss further industrial action tactics. So in my final sentence, I say this, Janice. This is the most pivotal moment that we have been in for years. The strike was absolutely brilliant. The government are waiting to see what we do so that they can move on the offensive even more rapidly. We have to stop them. That means in the next few days and weeks, we try to keep as many unions standing out to resist as possible. If we get that coalition reinstated, there should be an immediate public sector-wide strike of millions. But if we don't, if some unions do pull out, then I hope that every union that wants to carry on resisting will meet as a matter of urgency to plan the type of industrial action that we will need to win. Comrades, you played a brilliant role so far. I only wish that the leaders of all of your unions had stepped up a fraction to the plate as much as you have. Unfortunately, they haven't. They are infected with a deep-seated fatalism that you don't have and we don't have. So let's try to stop them pulling out. Let's redouble our efforts and say this. Our members' pensions were fought for over years, and we are not giving up to a bullying coalition government. We want to fight on, and the more of us who fight on, the better chance we have of winning.